Hi, I'm Mya-Rose Craig and I'm an 18-year-old environmental campaigner and activist. I'm also a birdwatcher and I blog under the name of Birdgirl, which I've been doing for about 6 years now. I've been birdwatching all of my life, literally. My parents have been taking me out since I was a baby, but I contribute part of that to my older sister, who was also a birdwatcher and a massive role model for me growing up. But because I've always been birdwatching, I have an incredibly strong connection to nature, which is a really important part of my life, and I've always felt the need to fight for the environment and fight for nature and biodiversity. Through my blog, Birdgirl, I never expected anyone to read it, but I was given a massive platform. And when more and more people started to read my blog, started to follow me on social media, I decided that I wanted to do some good with it. I wanted to create positive change. I started campaigning about all of the issues that I cared about and trying to either raise funds, raise awareness, or just help in some shape or form. And over again, I started contributing positively to these issues. I was really young, I was 12 at the time, and I had no idea what I was doing, but I just wanted to do some good, and I did. And it wasn't about knowing what I was doing or anything like that. It was literally just being stubborn and trying my best, and it worked. And that's all it takes a lot of the time. My big project, which I've been doing for about 5 years now, is all about diversity in nature, in the kinds of people going out into nature. I started my project when I was 13 years old, and again, I had no idea what I was doing. I'd never run a project, I'd never started an organisation, but again, I knew I wanted to create positive change, and I knew that because no one else was talking about this issue, I had to. I felt a responsibility, and so I started to, and even though it was really difficult and it was a massive learning curve, I have been doing this campaign for about 5 years now, and I've created massive change. I've managed to shift an entire sector and its attitudes towards diversity. I've started conversations in the environmental and climate change movement, and the change is still happening. And the lesson of it all isn't really that you need a massive platform online or you need to start a blog or anything like that. It's literally just, if you try hard enough, if you care enough about an issue, you should try and create change, because a lot of the time you'll succeed. My campaign for diversity in the environmental sector has involved loads of things. I've started an organisation called Black to Nature, which I've been running since I was 14, which has done loads of campaigning within the nature sector and worked with loads of really big organisations like Natural England, the Wildlife Trust and the RSPB. But I've also been running nature camps since I was 14, and this is the bit that was scariest when I was younger, because I'd never done anything like it before, and when I started, it felt like it was a bit of a disaster. It felt like it was a bit of a mess, and I was just terrified. And then I was in too deep. I felt like I couldn't stop at that point, so I just carried on pushing, carried on trying, and after a few days on that first camp, it all started to work out. And personally, I think that diversity and the types of people going out into the countryside, having that opportunity, working in the nature sector is so important, because of mental and physical health, because of, we need to have different voices contributing to the environmental movement. We're on the edge of an environmental crisis at the moment, but also because people don't deserve to be left out of areas, out of groups, because people deserve to have the opportunity to go out into green spaces. And as someone who's half Bangladeshi and had had those opportunities growing up, I felt it was so important. And as someone who is half Bangladeshi, I also care massively about the issue of climate change. Bangladesh is one of the worst affected countries in the world in terms of climate change at the moment, and people, including my own family, are suffering majorly. I've been campaigning on the subject of global climate justice for years now, which is basically talking about how the West has created climate change and we're palming off all of the hurt, all of the suffering and difficulties onto people in the global South, particularly people with very little resources and very little money. And I think it's so important personally to remember the human side of these environmental issues, which is what my campaigning's been all about. But my campaigning has also led me to some very exciting places. Only last month I was up in the Arctic with Greenpeace doing campaigning on climate change and biodiversity loss. As the Arctic melts, massive new swathes of oceans opened up that have no protection, where people want to do fishing and mining and other terrible human activities that will harm the animals, and we were fighting to protect these areas. But I also went up there to do the world's most northerly youth climate strike ever, to try and make an impact and to try and, I suppose, make a statement to show that despite everything, the youth aren't going to be quiet about climate change. We still care, and we still want positive change in the right direction. And it spread in a way that I had never imagined. I didn't think that newspapers all over the world were going to pick it up. I just knew that I wanted to make a statement, and that was all that mattered, really. The most important message to take away from this is that no matter how big or small the issue is, it's so important that you try and create positive change. All you have to remember is the good old saying, if not now, when, or if not me, who? I think it's young people's responsibility to try and make the world that we're going to inherit a better place. So go out there and create the change that you want to see. Hi, so that was me. I'm Mya-Rose Craig, and thank you guys so much for having me speak today. Like I said, I'm 18 years old, I'm an environmental activist, and also a diversity campaigner. So the main thing that I wanted to talk to you guys today about was actually something called global climate justice. So I think climate change is something that most people know about these days. There's a lot of things on social media, on the internet. Lots of people are going to Fridays for Future protests. And we're also constantly having things tell us how to be better and how to solve these problems. But what people don't talk about as much, I suppose, is the people when it comes to climate change. People talk a lot about the habitats, the landscapes that will lose, the way the animals suffer, but people don't talk, in my opinion, enough about people. So in my opinion, I think equality should be really important when it comes to the climate change movement, essentially looking at its impact on people and solving the problems with these people in mind and with the issues that affect them in mind. So for example, when we're talking about climate change itself, lots of people forget that for the most part, it's the West, so countries like the UK, like America, like Australia even, that have created the majority of the problem when it comes to climate change. But for the most part, it's much poorer countries in the global south, so places like Pacific Islands or Bangladesh that are being badly affected by climate change, and people are still being very poorly affected by it. And so the idea of global climate justice is to try and make that more equal. So for example, my mum's family is from Bangladesh, which, like I said, is a country that is really badly affected by climate change and is being, experiencing lots of negative side effects. And many people who live there are suffering in their day-to-day lives. And there's at the moment more than 4 million climate change refugees living in the capital city. So some of the effects that they're dealing with are hotter summers and colder winters and flooding and drought and like terrible storms. And that has a knock-on effect. So it means that things like farming become more difficult. And my granddad's village in the north of Bangladesh is surrounded by plains which naturally flood during the monsoon season, so when it rains a lot. But and during the monsoon season, you have to travel between these in very small boats. But 18 months ago, there were terrible droughts that meant these plains that fill with water were completely dry. There was no water at all. And it meant that their rice crop couldn't grow. And it meant that they couldn't grow any rice the next year either, because they lost all of the seeds that they were going to plant. And, if my family essentially hadn't been able to send money, then they wouldn't have had anything to eat. And a lot of these families don't have more family living in other countries that can send them money and resources, and it means that a lot of people are suffering. And another example is the fact that, so for example, fast fashion, so from shops like Primark,
is very bad for the environment. It uses a lot of water, it goes into the landfill nearly immediately, and it's very bad for the environment. But a lot of environmental activists are calling for people to just cut off fast fashion, to stop buying from shops from Primark, to stop buying clothes full stop in a lot of cases. But from what I've heard, no one ever talks about the other end of things. So, for example, in Bangladesh, again, the factories that make these clothes are incredibly important for the people with these jobs, for the people in the economy, especially for women that don't have other ways to support themselves. And, you know, the concept of global climate justice is basically asking what can we do to help on the other end of things to make sure that people have jobs, that they still have incomes. And I think it's so important to think about the whole process of things in order to properly fight climate change, basically, and one that, like I said, people don't talk about enough. But like I mentioned in the video, I also do a lot of work to do with diversity. So in the UK, there is, and globally actually, there's a big issue with the types of people that are able to go out into green spaces. And you know, it is a big issue for various reasons. So, for example, like I think lots of people have realized during lockdown, going outdoors is so important for your mental health, to make sure that you're looking after yourself, and also to be able to do things like play sports, to run around, to enjoy yourself basically, and not being able to go out even to the park or to the countryside or to anything like that is really bad for you. So I'm helping minority ethnic communities. So that's like people from whose families are from South Asia, from the Caribbean, places like that, to make sure that their families are able to go out into nature. But I also think it's super important because it comes back to this thing of global climate justice, where we're supposed to be very international and looking after people from around the world, and you know, not listening, I suppose, to massive groups of people in society and not hearing their input into how to help them, is also ignoring this whole thing of global climate justice. And because climate change and other environmental issues are so universal, they're affecting everyone, it's really important that we also listen to everyone to understand how they're going to be affected. So like I said, I started my project when I was in year 7 or year 8. I was very young and I just wanted to make change. And when I talk to other kids, I think there's always very much this feeling of, you know, not having enough time, enough experience, enough almost push to be able to start things, to create change for yourself. And I think you know, just going out and doing things always makes a difference. Like, even if it's something that you're like, oh, anyone could do that, like no one else is. So it's still important that you go and do that thing. And it can be as minor as, you know, riding your bike more, making sure that your parents are recycling every week, to, you know, going to protests, to signing petitions. And I think um, as young people, really, it's so important that we make our voices heard in terms of environmental issues, because we're the ones that are going to be affected in 10, 20, 30 years time. So one way that I did that recently is, like I mentioned, I was really lucky. I got to go up to the Arctic with Greenpeace in September, which was the coolest experience in my life. But it was also, you know, very sad because the Arctic is disappearing because of climate change. And I could see it melting when I was up there. I could see that it was getting smaller and smaller, and there weren't many animals around or anything like that, because again, the Arctic is dying essentially. And it was really sad, which is why I decided that I wanted to take part in the big Fridays for Future thing in September and stage a protest up there. And I literally just asked Greenpeace, like, oh, could you help me make a sign? I want to do a protest on the ice. And they helped me. And I think for me, it wasn't about, like I said, it wasn't about trying to make this massive change, this massive movement. I just felt that as a young person, I had to make a statement about climate change while I had the opportunity, because it is such an important issue. So I literally just sat out on the ice for hours, doing my solo youth protest, which again was very sad, but I felt very like strong at the same time. Like, I think there's something incredibly empowering about having the opportunity to, to speak, even if it's metaphorically. And yeah, I just think, people don't acknowledge the fact a lot of the time that climate change is going to affect us in the future, that it is our future that's literally melting down the drain. And I also got to speak with Greta, which was another thing which was probably the coolest thing in my life, back in February, just before lockdown. And I think it was seeing her in real life, in Bristol, that made me realize like how powerful she is. Like, she's around my age, but she was so strong, and when she spoke you could hear a pin drop. And I respect her so much because she's not, she acknowledges the fact that she's still in school. We're still children, and we're not supposed to be the scientists that are coming up with the answers, and she refuses to tell politicians, tell world leaders how they're going to fix the issue. She just refuses to allow it to sort of sink into the background, I suppose. She wants to make sure that it's on the agenda and that people are talking about it and dealing with it, but making sure that they are the ones that are finding the solutions. And I think she's incredibly strong for that. And I think, it's so easy for climate change to become, or other environmental issues to become, background issues, because they're never quite seen as being as important as things like the economy, or things like that, even though it's all completely connected and it all affects each other. And so I think really the thing to take away from all of this is the fact that even though people try and tell us all the time, young people do have a voice and we have an opportunity to create change. But it doesn't work unless you go out and you do it and you try and commit that change yourself, whatever the issue is that you care about. So if anyone wants to ask any questions, like, I'm fully open to that. Okay, so if there was one thing that came out of the Youth Climate Summit, what would you want it to be? That's a really good question. I think, there's so many different things. It's sort of what I was saying before, in that I just want, like, I feel like so much effort goes into sort of constantly telling young people that our voices don't matter and that we shouldn't, I suppose, interfere in politics, or even though these are the issues that affect us too, even though we're not old enough to vote or whatever. And so I want young people to go out and start trying to make a difference. And I think it can be really hard. It can be really exhausting sometimes, because, people go out their way to, I suppose, not listen to us. But if you push hard enough, people can't ignore you anymore, and it does make a difference. What's the first thing you think government should do? Yeah, I think that is a really difficult question in terms of climate change. I think there's so many different options. Like, at the moment, I feel like the bar is very low. I want governments to acknowledge that climate change is the issue that is going to affect us the most in the future, and I want climate change to be a priority for them, which is such like low expectations, but that's what I want. But I think going forward, I want the environment to always take precedence, to be the most important issue, instead of being constantly sidelined. And eventually, I guess I want governments to work towards a better and greener future where we don't have to worry about things like climate change, which feels very much like a dream at the moment, but that's what I want. The Arctic trip was amazing. What was a highlight, or what did you learn? I think kind of like I said, like it was like a highlight was probably my youth strike on the ice, just because for the most part I was living on a Greenpeace ship, and that was one of the few opportunities I got to actually go out on the ice and I suppose probably be out in the Arctic. But in terms of learning, I think one of the biggest things for me was because it was something that was quite spontaneous. Like I wasn't setting out, like I literally, they were going on this trip anyway, and I sort of hijacked it. And this youth strike thing was very spontaneous. Just a few days before, I was like, oh, could I do a youth strike? And I think the biggest learning thing was for me that I suppose I can just do things. Like it doesn't have to be really planned out. I don't have to know exactly what I was doing. I can just do the things that I hope will make a difference, and hopefully it will. How do you think we can help people in the UK to really get the impact of climate change, to feel it deeply when we're not facing the issues every day like those in Bangladesh? I think in England, in the UK, like the way people talk about climate change is really weird. Like people always say that we're not being affected or that we're not feeling it as much, and to an extent we're not. Like we're a very wealthy country, and for the most part we can deal with the impacts that we feel. But for example, I live near Somerset, which is a place that's really, really badly affected by flooding, like every single year. And I think that the way people talk about that is really strange because it's only been happening for like 10 years roughly, and every year in the newspapers they're just sort of like, oh, it's this really bad flooding that happens every year now, and no one ever talks about the fact that it's really like it's an effect of climate change that's washing people's homes away. And I suppose getting people to acknowledge those really tangible things, like when we get those really, really hot days in the summer, when we get drought, when we get flooding. But I think also like just talking to people more about climate change, because I think a lot of people like feel like they're not the ones that are going to be affected, it's going to be someone else. But the reality is that 10 years ago, they would have been shocked at how much we're feeling it now in the UK, and we'd be shocked at how much they're going to be feeling it in 10 years' time if they don't deal with it. And I suppose just making sure that people know that, you know, it's not something off in a distant country, it's something that is right here and right now. What's your tips for other young people and how we can get our voices heard? So that, like I said, that's really tricky. Because I do think people don't want to listen to young people. I think a really easy springboard at the moment in terms of environmental stuff is literally just going to these youth strikes for not at the moment, maybe that's not very COVID friendly, but like I suppose involving yourself in the movement, even if it's in a really small way, which even that can feel really intimidating. But getting you and like a couple of friends to go to youth strikes, or to sign petitions online, to follow accounts on like Instagram or whatever that teach you about these things. And I think slowly, as you sort of read more and consume more information and learn more about all of these issues that we're dealing with, I think most people feel quite motivated to try and do something about it. But I think the biggest thing is just you know, literally doing whatever you can, like I was saying before, like these really small things, like I don't know, cycling to school, like eating a bit less meat, like they make all the difference. And I think even just talking to your friends, to your teachers, whatever, about these small actions, it does make a difference, even though it doesn't feel like it. How did you get your school on board? Mine won't listen. Yeah, this is also really tricky because I think a lot of people in the older generations who like aren't at school don't really understand why you would want to miss school to go and do protests and things like that. And I think, you know, like I guess it's just not having that feeling of, you know, the urgency of the issue. Like it's our futures, our generation that's going to be the worst affected at the moment. So I think like I was very lucky. I was in sixth form when it started. So when I was skiving off school to go to protest, they couldn't technically do anything. But when I was talking to friends who went to other schools or who are a bit younger, they said the biggest thing was to get their family on board, to get them to write a note. And I suppose to just help the other people around you understand why you think it's so important, like in general as well. But maybe I shouldn't advocate this, but if worse comes to worse, you could always call in sick. No, that's terrible. I shouldn't say that, sorry. But I think just making sure that the people around you understand why you feel the need. Because I think most kids, when it comes to normal issues, wouldn't want to skive off school to go to a protest month after month. Like, that takes real desperation and real urgency around an issue. What's your advice to others who want to start their own project? Did you do this alone, with friends or family? Yeah, so I was really lucky. So my mum especially, but my parents helped me a lot with my project, but it was fully like me who started it. And I think the biggest thing, which I kind of talked about in the video, was literally that you don't need to be an expert in any, like, you don't need to have a massive understanding of what it takes to run a project. When you start a project, just do what you want. So for the people under 18, which I think is all of you, like, there's a really good organization called the Burns Price Foundation, which gives out money to projects that are run by people under 18. And I think finding little organizations like that that can help you is so important. But the biggest thing really is just to do, just to do it and go out there and make it happen. Because I genuinely think the biggest obstacle to overcome is, making it happen in the first place. And you can figure everything out after. And I guess also just keeping in mind that it's not going to go to plan, like it never does. But you just have to be flexible and make it work. And it's so satisfying when a project that you're running, it starts to work and it does start to make a difference, which it will if you stick to it. What advice would you give to current 13, 14-year-olds who may be shy and anxious but want a strong voice for change? Yeah, so you guys might have seen today, like, I'm very happy to just like chat, and not always saying the best things, but I'm very happy to just talk. But when I was like 12, 13, like, I was really scared of not public speaking, but just speaking in general and making my voice heard, and I suppose being very assertive in that. And I think for me, the biggest thing that made a difference was realizing that, my voice was important, basically. Like, it did make a difference whether I spoke or not, if that makes sense. Like, I think before, I always felt like, oh, it doesn't, like, I feel quite shy, I don't want to say anything now, but it doesn't matter because someone else will say what I'm thinking. But they never did. And I started to realize that I had to, I suppose, build up that courage and say what I wanted to say. But it's really scary. And I think, like, it's really cliche, but I do think that the biggest thing is just to practice. And even if that's just like putting things on your Instagram story that are a bit more like assertive than usual, just like practicing using your voice and being, strong in that. And over time, you'll start to realize that you are more and more happy to speak about the things that you care about. Youth culture seems very geared towards consumerism. We're bombarded with demands for us to buy things all the time. How can we convince young people that there's more to life than buying material things? Yeah, I think, okay. So consumerism, or basically encouraging people to buy loads of stuff all the time if they don't need it, is a really, really big issue. And it's really bad for the environment, but it's also like not a great thing for you as a person, because I think we always feel like we'll be slightly happier or like more content if we buy the next thing and it never works. And I think, so you can deal with the issue in like very surface level ways. So for example, thrifting and things like that is very trendy at the moment. And like, I suppose going into charity shops and finding your clothes is very cool, which I think has been amazing for the environment in the last few years. But I think in general, like, that doesn't solve the overall issue. And I used to, like, this is quite bad, but I used to buy a lot of just stuff all the time. But it never made me happier. I just had less money. And I think like realizing that, and I suppose really acknowledging that the stuff I had already was enough, made all the difference for me. And I suppose getting very cynical about advertising and stuff like that as well. And now whenever I see an ad like on social media, I'm like, no, like I don't want to touch that. And, like, I think also like not being guilty when you do buy things as well. Like I think it's very difficult to be an environmentalist sometimes because like you feel very hypocritical, like, oh, I'm buying a top, so I guess I'm not a good environmentalist anymore. But everyone's just trying to do their best, and it's okay if you need to buy things or if you slip up or whatever sometimes. Like you're still trying your best, and that's all that matters really, because it's hard. What is your favorite bird? Okay. So in the UK, I'm going to be very cliche. My favorite bird is a robin. I love them. I think they're very, very cute. And you know, they're always around in my garden and stuff. But around the world, my favorite is basically, it's from Australia. It is about 6 feet tall. It's called a southern cassowary. In my opinion, it looks a little bit like a dinosaur. And it also has these massive, massive talons, and they get very aggressive, and they do, you know, if they wanted to, they could slice people up. And I saw one when I was like 11, and it was so exciting. Like it's literally one of the coolest birds I have ever seen. Yeah. So yeah, I think if that's, oh, okay. If we just stop buying, what will happen to people's jobs? Yeah, so that's a really good question. And yeah, I guess I brushed on this earlier. But at the moment, there are a lot of people around the world that rely on basically fast fashion, making clothes in factories, things like that, especially women, and especially in poorer countries. And we can't just stop buying, really. So there's 2 ways we could go. One could be pushing shops like Primark that sell fast fashion to just be better, to use less water, to pay people more, to you know, sell their clothes that are slightly pricier but will last longer. But I think that's very difficult because, you know, it's all about money for most of these shops. And so the other option is sort of on the other end of things, to go into these countries or work with people in these countries to help, you know, create new jobs, convert them. So if we go back to my example of Bangladesh, a lot of these factories that are full of people making our clothes at the moment could be converted to make all sorts of other things instead. So for example, like, you know, more sustainable things, and making it more fair for the workers in them, because it's not great conditions at the moment. So whether that's making clothes that are a bit more sustainable or making a completely different product, but you do have to think, at least as an activist and a campaigner, in my opinion, you have to think about the other side, I suppose, and making sure that no one's losing out because of your own campaigning. Okay, yeah, so the last question. What's one top tip you would recommend to young people do to help make change? I did not read that out right, sorry. I think, okay, I think, am I allowed to say 2? I'm gonna say 2. So the first one is kind of like what I was saying before, just go out and do things. Like it's very scary, but you do just need to do if you want to make change, whether that's big or small actions. But I think also, you know, making a support network for yourself, helping, like trying to like convert your friends and stuff like that, talking to your parents about it, your teachers, even just people around you, and you know, making sure that you're not alone in this, because it can be really difficult if it's just you. And I think even just having a couple of friends to help you along makes all the difference. Yeah, but at the end of the day, like if you want to make change, you have to go out and do it, and it's as simple as that. Thank you.